legal cannabis industry has unlocked generational wealth opportunities across the country. But the industry's regulatory complexities, constant state of change, and speed of evolution drive confusion for entrepreneurs and investors alike. On this podcast, we'll interview the industry leaders who are shaping the future of the legal cannabis industry to help our listeners understand these idiosyncrasies. This is Cannabis Unlocked, hosted by Key Investment Partners. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Ben Ross. Ben, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Jordan.
Awesome. So thanks so much for joining, Ben. For our listeners, Ben's a friend of mine who recently sold his software business, Power.io, to Pluribus Technologies, and is now spending his time more focused on the psychedelics industry, which has always been an area of mutual interest for us. And I think for a lot of our listeners who are involved in the cannabis space, the psychedelic sector is obviously a natural point of interest as well. And so on this conversation today, we wanted to really dive deeper into the history of the industry, but also kind of also get into our personal experiences with psychedelics, how we think the industry is going to evolve and kind of go from there. So with that, Ben, thanks again for joining. Would love if you could just provide a little bit of introduction on yourself and your background.
Well, absolutely. First of all, it's a pleasure to have this chat, Jordan, and appreciate you kind of going outside of some of the ordinary topics and stretching a little bit here. So to give kind of a quick background, I spent about a decade first climbing the what we might call the academic achievement ladder. And got a bachelor's and master's at Penn State and came out to UC Berkeley, did a PhD and a postdoc there, all in engineering or interdisciplinary fields of engineering. And so I kind of saw what that game was about and was kind of ready for a new game and spent the next decade or so climbing what we might call the capitalist achievement ladder. And starting a bunch of companies, and I think probably two of the better known ones would be Lucira Health, which came out with the first at-home COVID test earlier this year and went public shortly thereafter, and Power.io, which you mentioned, which provides website tools to help small businesses grow online, and we exited that just a few months ago this year as well. So, I'll just add to that. I've been, an angel investor over the past few years, including some interest in the cannabis space and kind of the larger consciousness and mind opening, heart opening kind of space. And I think that's how we got connected originally. So that kind of takes me to where we are today.
Absolutely. That's fantastic, Ben. And so, as you mentioned, the consciousness and wellness space, what was there a driving kind of event in your life that really got you more interested in the space and psychedelics in particular, or was it more like of a gradual evolution?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, to provide some context, I grew up in suburban Pennsylvania in pretty much the 90s, early 2000s. And looking back, that was the height or the still ramping up of so-called war on drugs. And, I was thinking the other day, I don't know if you remember this or saw this, there was this like ad campaign that was running, I think in the 80s and 90s as well, like different versions. And this guy would like hold up an egg and very serious, this is your brain. And then he'd crack it into a pan and then his close up of this frying egg. And this is your brain on drugs. And so this was a kind of programming that I think, many of us in this generation kind of grew up with very strong, like drugs are bad, kind of very, very clear message. And I certainly took that programming to heart. I didn't try any strongly, psychoactive substance, except for, the good drugs, the caffeine and alcohol that, half of us are addicted to. Until I was about 30 years old, I was living in San Francisco. And I think I reached a point where my curiosity had kind of finally outweighed some of that childhood programming. And so I got a cannabis card. This was kind of before legalization, so you had to go in and get a card from a doctor. And we usually don't talk about or think about cannabis as a psychedelic, but certainly it was a very strong teacher in showing me that there are what we might call non-ordinary states of reality, right? There are other ways of being and perceiving the world. And that kind of started getting me into a space where I could see kind of my own thoughts, my own mental patterns kind of, floating by like a cloud and not being so caught in the thoughts that we're typically caught in all day. So that was really my first introduction. And if we fast forward a few years, I was running Power IO, which is as anyone who's run a startup knows, it's a real 24/7 kind of effort. And so a few years in, I finally was ready for a vacation, my first vacation in probably 2 or 3 years. And so I went to Peru and I ended up on an ayahuasca retreat. And an ayahuasca, for those not familiar, is a brew of plants. It's a tea essentially that has been drunk in a ceremonial context for at least thousands of years in several parts of South America. So this is kind of a traditional, you might say, shamanic type medicine. And that was a really, really profoundly shifting experience. And not that, I didn't come back and I wasn't going barefoot into the office, and you can see I don't have dreadlocks. I was still able to, come back and play the startup game and operate effectively in the world. But it kind of took me down this path that is really just brought a lot of peace into my life. And just something that at this point I feel compelled to share with others, because it's just an amazing tool, amazing technology that's in our world that we're really just finding out about in our kind of Western culture.
That's fantastic, Ben. And a lot of ways I think we can take that conversation. And I certainly do remember that commercial you're talking about. This is your mind on drugs. And I think my path has a lot of echoes of similarities, right? So I grew up in the suburbs of Cincinnati, was inundated with that same idea of drugs are horrible, and we'll get into what we consider drugs versus medicine later. But, and I think in psychedelics in particular, you heard these ideas that you can, think you fly and you'll jump off a building, or it sticks in your fat cells for 20 years and you'll just be driving and have a, regression of these past experiences. So, I think that fear really pervaded a lot of society. And so that's why I think one of the main reasons why I thought it'd be great to have this conversation to really just help destigmatize the substances and let folks know that, there are really fantastic benefits if you're taking them in the right setting. So anyway, just to kind of quickly give, my background with psychedelics and cannabis as well. Experimented with cannabis occasionally during college, but it really wasn't until I moved to Colorado about 5 years ago that I became a regular consumer. And it's actually, I think, been a really helpful substance for me in getting off of alcohol and focusing exclusively on that. And, on the psychedelic side, I had my first experience at Burning Man actually back in 2015, which is about as cliche as it comes. But I was terrified before it just because of all the things I'd heard. And, thankfully I'd had a really close friend who had some experiences herself, and she kind of got me comfortable with it. And that first experience was really enjoyable, but it was taken, I'd say, more in, a party context, like a lot of people today still take it. So not really fully understanding the implications of what these substances can do. And then fast forward to call it 2018, when Michael Pollan and Tim Ferriss started, really shining a great light on all of the resurgence and research that's being done in the history of the substances. I got a renewed interest in them, naturally, as the cannabis industry, I think, kind of segues into psychedelics. It made sense to start familiarizing myself with them. And so, I had a number of experiences over the last few years where I think, didn't have a full ego dissolution event, but had a lot of, very introspective, reflective moments that I think helped me work out a lot of issues with my own ego, with my own insecurities, on kind of the mental health side. But then I think a part of the conversation that doesn't get enough focus, which you touched on earlier, is I also think it really improves creativity. I think it, problem solving. I don't know. I feel like I've learned to connect dots in ways that I didn't beforehand. And then fast forward to actually earlier this year, I had my first experience with, what I'll call full dissolution of the ego, and, connected to a higher level of consciousness, which, without getting too far into it, has just given me a renewed sense of purpose and love and respect for life and this planet, and doing everything possible to improve the future. So, I mean, obviously want to get into the risks and not point rose-colored glasses on the substances by any means, because there are certainly risks, which I think we should touch on. But, I think long story short is personally, they've been nothing but positive for my life. And I'm really excited about building the future of this industry and really helping to see what these substances can do for humanity as a whole.
Yeah, I really resonate with that sentiment, and thank you for sharing your journey. I know in this context you're often the question asker and just receiving, but I think there's a lot to give as well, and appreciate hearing the journey.
Absolutely. So from there, would love to talk a little bit about what are some of the key psychedelics that people, may be familiar with or have heard of. You mentioned ayahuasca, obviously. I think LSD, also known as acid, psilocybin, which are magic mushrooms, mescaline are some of the ones that really come to mind. So we'd love if we can kind of dive a little bit and kind of differentiate each of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one thing that comes to mind, we talk about, you mentioned psychedelic industry or market, and what is this market? And the way I see it, there's really kind of three different branches, and it might be worth just kind of outlining that for a moment in kind of how this is likely to evolve over the next few years. There's kind of the clinical model, we could say, which is, you go to a therapist or someone that is in some way licensed to assist you in working with these substances. And that model, so let's call that model one, the kind of clinical model. There's the second model, which is what I was talking about a little bit when I talked about going to South America, which is more of the traditional model. And that's people coming together. It could be one person, it could be a group of people coming together with some experienced facilitator, we could say, and that might be someone playing more of a shaman type role, or it may be just kind of a helper or a sitter. But there's still a very intentional setting, like people are coming to do healing or do deep inner work, and this is a kind of a second context that we're finding and seeing kind of grow here in the US as well as around the world. And then the third one is kind of the underground market, which is kind of the everything else, and that can look more like a clinic, like it can look like someone sitting for someone as a therapist. It can look more like a kind of an underground version of a shamanic ceremony. Or it can look like, as you mentioned at Burning Man, kind of a recreational model where the intention is to have fun, and we still are gonna treat these substances with respect and think about the context. But the goal is, there's nothing wrong with recreating ourselves, recreation, if you pull that apart. And so, depending on which context we're talking about, these substances or the plants that are worked with might be slightly different. So in the clinic, which is the most kind of above ground, and as we talk about the industry, if we're looking at this with kind of investor hat on, that's kind of the rapidly growing area in the next few years, with Oregon's legalization of psilocybin, which I'm sure we can talk about a bit. So the kind of three substances that I think about in a clinical model, one is actually ketamine, which is already pretty widely available. I think there's, at this point, probably around 1,000, maybe over 1,000 clinics in the U.S. and various states that are working with ketamine for mental, typically depression or kind of other mental conditions that you might want to work through. So that one's kind of the furthest along. We see MDMA is kind of right on the horizon, with an organization called MAPS, has done a tremendous amount over multiple decades in getting that to be toward approval as an FDA approved medicine for psychedelic assisted therapy for PTSD and kind of related conditions. So that one we're looking at, probably 2 years or so in terms of approval there. And then psilocybin is likely to be kind of following that in terms of FDA approval. And in specific states, like Oregon was the first state, has already slated that to be used in a clinical setting in a year or two. So that's going to be coming pretty soon. So those are kind of the three in that model that are the kind of the furthest along for kind of the various reasons of how they were developed and the whole regulatory process. It's not necessarily to say that those are the best medicines to use in that context, but because of some of the history, that's where they are. Now, ayahuasca, for example, is typically not used in that context, and that's typically going to be more in the traditional model of more shamanic, more ceremonial, or church-like. So it's like we have all of these wonderful characters that are out there, these different medicines, and as well as these different contexts. And I wouldn't say that they're all for everyone. I think depending on kind of an individual and where they're sitting in their own mind and their interest and their kind of resonance with these different substances or different technologies, I think some might be more appropriate than others in a particular phase in someone's life.
Yep, I think that makes total sense, and it seems like, to your point about the work that's being done at MAPS and psilocybin, it seems like MDMA and psilocybin will probably be the first ones that people have access to. And, would love to get your thoughts on if you think those are the appropriate starting points. I think in my view, and I recently listened to Rick Doblin from MAPS, did a podcast on Lex Friedman, and he was talking about a lot of these kind of distinctions around how long they last, around, how cerebral they are, how intense they are, with obviously ones like ayahuasca and DMT being more intensive and that kind of thing. So for folks who maybe haven't ever taken psychedelics, but are interested or curious, do you have any recommendations for kind of first steps on how they can obtain them legally and safely, and specific substances that you'd recommend over others?
Yeah, sure. I think we could talk a bit about, well, I guess we might as well dive into some examples. I think, MDMA is, as Rick Doblin has kind of, he's been working on this for many years and has thought about this a lot longer than either of us have. And I think MDMA makes a lot of sense. One from as you mentioned, the time span. Something like a mescaline containing plant like San Pedro or peyote can last for 10, 12 hours. Is just not super feasible to work with in a clinical setting, because it becomes tremendously expensive. It requires a tremendous amount of time. And so MDMA and psilocybin are both, fairly reasonable in that, maybe four-ish hour time frame where you can go in and have a session. So there's a certain kind of just practicality there that works with those medicines. MDMA in particular is such a gentle and kind of heart opening or heartwarming kind of medicine. It's something that I would say it's pretty hard to have a really bad time working with MDMA if you're in a safe, well-supported container. It's hard to have a bad time, because it really just brings you to, and I use bad in quotes. It's kind of the extra judgment layer that we want to put on it.
Right.
So I think that is kind of a very gentle introduction into these kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness, and being able to look at, we've all experienced some trauma. Like you don't get to be an adult in the world without having some trauma from childhood, from our relationships, rejections, all these different ways that we go in the world and get hurt in various ways. And it really lets us kind of take a look at what's going on under the surface, and if there's trauma, if there's stuff that we're kind of carrying from the past that isn't serving us, that we could let go. It kind of gives us a way of looking at those in a very gentle way, and kind of allowing ourselves to clarify and kind of shift how we want to greet each day and live our lives. So I think that is a very gentle and great introduction to medicine. And I think psilocybin is also, and of course with all of these medicines, the dose is extremely important. So, you can have, and even we're talking about cannabis, a large cannabis dose can be just as psychedelic or just as strong, and potentially, incapacitating, can be extremely positive, can be extremely, damaging or scary, without the right context, and really kind of the right dose for where you are in your mindset. So, with that being said, I think psilocybin tends to be a little bit more gentle, at reasonable doses, where, for example, ayahuasca can be a stronger and more kind of diving into the deep end of the pool, for example. And, I'm not sure why ayahuasca is the one that has kind of really resonated with me and on my journey thus far. And, maybe it's just that, I was trained as such a rational kind of right brain, left brain, engineer, that I need an equally strong substance to balance out and kind of find that intuitive heart mind that is, almost invisible in some aspects of our culture. Just needed that balance for me personally.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. And, I think one of the great things about psilocybin in particular is that's, I think, where we've seen the most regulatory change, right? So it's now decriminalized in Denver, Santa Cruz, Oakland, DC, Oregon. It's fully legal, and sales will start in 2023. So I think that, obviously decriminalization is not full legalization, and getting the product itself still is tricky. But point is, it's good to see that there are starting to be legal avenues that people can take these substances and really, experience their effects firsthand. And you made a great point about, drug and dosage, which I really want to dive into further, because I think that'll kind of lead us then into the history of psychedelics, help people understand why they were made illegal in the first place with the Controlled Substances Act. But I do think that there's two distinctions that people tend to conflate. And so I think it's important to clear those up. So the first being the distinction between drug versus medicine. The second being illegal versus legal substance, right? And so what I mean with the first breakdown is the line between what's a medicine and a drug is dosage, right? So almost any substance, if you have too much of it, becomes very dangerous. I mean, water, for example, you have too much water, you can die from that, right? But, even for more typical medicines, right, like aspirin and painkillers and that kind of thing, obviously, if you have too much, it becomes very harmful. And that's when it can become a drug. And one of the biggest issues with drug prohibition in general, and why I've kind of consistently beaten the horn that drug prohibition causes way more problems than it solves, but it's specifically around this dosage question, right? And that when you're buying something illegally off the black market, you don't really know the dosage that you're getting. So that can really obviously have significant impacts on what you experience, obviously. And in LSD, I think in particular, I'd highlight, because the dosage here is very, very small. I think the typical recommended dosage is about 100 micrograms, right? And so it's very difficult to control that when you have no idea of the source product and where you're getting it from. So I think that's one of the reasons that can cause issues. And so I think now we should probably get a little bit more into the history of the war on drugs. And, Timothy Leary is one of the important figures in the history of psychedelics. And he wrote a lot about, the reason people can have bad trips is because they didn't take the right dosage, or because they weren't prepared for what they were experiencing. But then taking a step back, the distinction between legal and illegal, right? This was something that was really created back in 1970 under the Controlled Substances Act, which was passed during the Nixon administration. And, we can discuss this a little further, but as history has proven, the substances that were included as as Schedule I substances, like cannabis, like MDMA, and LSD and psilocybin, a lot of the rationale for that had nothing to do whatsoever with the medical efficacy of those substances, but rather had much more to do with political and racially driven motivations, right? And so the point is, just because a substance is illegal does not mean it's a drug. And conversely, just because something's legal does not mean it's a safe medicine at any quantity. And I think we've obviously seen that with the opioid epidemic, and I think people in general would resonate with the idea that alcohol is generally a more harmful substance to individuals and to society than is cannabis, right? So I think it's important that people break free from these preconceived paradigms and stigmas around substances that have been illegal for the last 50 years and really understand the full cultural and historic context of them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because we grew up in kind of the product of this history that you're talking about, which is really fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk about for hours. But it's it's just interesting how these, essentially it's a myths, the myths and stories that our culture hands to us, and we believe them. And I think, as you mentioned, we're kind of in what feels to be this wave of kind of collective realization that perhaps some of these myths and stories that we've been told really aren't true. At least they aren't true for our generation, aren't true for us. And there's kind of a sort of re-understanding of some of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s. And I think, what I like to do is actually even zoom out further. If you zoom out to just humans on this planet living in various cultures, the vast majority of them, I'm talking about multiple millennia, kind of pre-modern Western civilization, many of them have used psychedelics or mind-altering plants or substances as an important part of their culture. And it's amazing how diverse this is. I mean, you can look at the Greeks had the Eleusinian mysteries, among others. In the Americas, there's a ton of different tribes. In the South, we were talking about ayahuasca. They're mescaline-containing cactuses in North America. The psilocybin-containing mushrooms in Central America. It's actually hard to find cultures that didn't use some sort of psychedelic material. So we're in a way, we're the exception. It's kind of the opposite question of, wait, what is it about our culture that we've completely banned a certain subset of plants? It's kind of an interesting reflection that we could also, philosophize about for a while. But, a lot of what seemed to get us, at least in my understanding, to kind of the modern way of legalization or lack thereof, is that because we had this culture where psychedelics came in quite suddenly to a culture that didn't have, as I mentioned, when I went to Peru, there's a tradition. There are elders that are going to hold space and give you a certain dose and really make sure that you have a safe, we might say, initiation, into working with these types of plants. And when psychedelics were introduced into our culture through Timothy Leary and others, they kind of lacked elders or lacked containers, and that did lead to conditions where sometimes people were doing them in unsafe ways or dangerous ways, and also a very equal and opposite fear reaction, which happened with the establishment, including the political establishment that got quite scared of what these substances would kind of suddenly do to the culture. And that kind of polarizing environment led to this banning and, them going underground and being associated with the counterculture, and has kind of led to this really, what really feels like a dark age, this kind of like dark ages for multiple decades, where very little research has been done. And, this, you just think about how many people could have been cured from depression and PTSD and all these other conditions, because this was really such a dramatic kind of shutting the books or kind of a book burning on psychedelics when they came into our culture.
Yeah, and I think that's a great perspective to have, is to really flip it on its head and not say, why should psychedelics be legal, but rather, why has our culture in the short period in the history of humanity and civilization decided that these substances need to be made illegal? And we've made a number of references to Timothy Leary, and I'd love to give a little bit of my understanding of kind of what the background of the history of psychedelics was. Obviously, I wasn't around in the 60s, but from my reading, and this is my understanding. And Ben would love if you'd hop in to correct anything I may be misinterpreting. But my understanding was the beginning of the 60s was kind of this confluence of factors where a lot of these ancient traditions, throughout the Americas in particular, were starting to resonate with the academic community. And so folks like Timothy Leary, like Stan Groff, Rick Doblin, and others among them realized that these could have huge implications for psychology and mental health improvement and the like. So anyway, Timothy Leary, came to Harvard as a psychology professor shortly after having a very profound experience on, I believe it was psilocybin in Mexico. And then anyway, decided to start doing research with graduate students with both psilocybin and LSD. The early results of those findings were really impressive, and had some really dramatic findings. But unfortunately, his partner Richard Alpert at one point gave some psychedelics to an undergraduate student, which was against the rules that they'd agreed to with Harvard. Richard Alpert got fired. So then Timothy Leary quit in resignation. The two of them moved to New York and started kind of doing a lot of psychedelic experiments, outside the purview of an academic institution. Then this kind of spread culturally across the country. Folks on the West Coast started, I'd say, taking these psychedelics very rapidly, very unintentionally, unconsciously. And so this kind of led to this huge backlash wherein Richard Nixon at one point called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. Timothy Leary was later caught with a half an ounce of marijuana trying to take it to Mexico, and they tried to lock him up for 40 years. So it created this huge cultural backlash that led to psychedelics being included as controlled substances for the last 50 years. Until finally, some of the folks who had been doing research during this time, but in a more measured, more scientific approach, kind of continued the research, and then we're able to say, hey guys, we need to revisit this. There's a lot of great work to be done. And so, and Richard Alpert, interestingly enough, later became a gentleman named Ram Dass. He took the learnings he had under psychedelic experiences, moved to India to learn from gurus there, and really incorporate Eastern spirituality, brought that back to the Western society, and then I'd say has been really an instrumental figure in building Western spirituality, which I think could be reflective of what the future of psychedelics can have for our culture, right? Where we look at psychedelics as a way of combining Western allopathic medicine with more integrative medicine from the East. So including psychedelic therapies, including meditation and the like. So, really interesting background, but yeah, Ben, what are your thoughts? Am I missing any of the key details there?
I mean, that was like an awesome, I don't know how long that was, 60-second summary of really a lot of the key points of the whole movement. And I'm glad you mentioned Ram Dass, because he's just been a wonderful teacher for me as well. And I think points to, the kind of the opposite of your brain on drugs being the frying pan that we were talking about earlier. That really, it was a tool that was able to get his mind to a really a place of peace to the point that he, after his phase of kind of experimentation, he only really rarely worked with psychedelics because, there's another great gentleman, Alan Watts, who used to speak about this. Is basically once you get the message, you hang up the phone, which is, these are incredible tools that give you an insight into yourself. It's into the insights they give you are already present inside yourself, and they're just kind of the telescope showing you the way. So yeah, I think that's a great summary and a lot of wisdom there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it also kind of Timothy Leary's story can show you a little bit of the risks associated with it, where if you start taking them wantonly, if you're not incorporating the messages that you're being shown on these substances, then, it can lead to these backlashes where there's a division between, I guess, the law and individuals. But so anyway, so moving forward, would love to get your thoughts on what does the future look like for legal psychedelics, right? So first question I'd love to ask is, do you believe that it's a fundamental human right to be able to explore your own consciousness?
Well, certainly, I think exploring your consciousness is actually one of the few things that no one can take away from you. Because if you can breathe, right, we can take a nice breath. Like what a gift. If you can breathe, you can explore your own consciousness. And it doesn't even require an external substance. It just requires you to kind of let go of the stories that are churning on in your mind and just kind of drop into the richness of the present moment. But I think to get at deeper, maybe what's underlying that question, I would say that it's certainly an unalienable right to develop our own relationship with nature. And it's kind of insane if you were to, come as an alien or, come as an external species. And, around my yard, I have some oleander growing. And, one leaf of that plant could kill me. It's an incredibly poisonous plant, but it's not illegal. We let that grow everywhere. But, for example, if I were to have a peyote cactus growing right next to it, that would be illegal. So I think we do have to reclaim our kind of relationship with nature, and these plants and fungi have a tremendous amount to teach us, and we need to kind of reclaim that right that's been lost. And I think the only other thing I'd add there is, the First Amendment protects our rights to practice religion, and the word religion and churches have a lot of stigma in our culture. But I would say anyone, if you were to sit with ayahuasca in a ceremonial context and say that is not a religious experience, I'd be very surprised. Or I don't know anyone that has had that experience, and not realize that there's a deep kind of spiritual sort of level to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the short answer is I would say absolutely.
And it's really interesting you bring up, and you'd mentioned earlier the road to Eleusis, and the fact that, a lot of ancient Greeks, it's now widely known that, folks like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, this was a big part of the culture, was to take this journey to Eleusis and have this transcendental experience with ergot, which is the substance that LSD is synthesized from. So it's not just a new phenomenon again. And I think there's actually some really interesting work coming out now. There's a book called The Immortality Key that talks about the idea that the first sacrament was not wine, but instead was likely a combination drink that included psychedelics. So really interesting information coming out, nowadays that, again, points to the fact that we're in this strange cultural paradigm today where psychedelics are illegal, right? We're the anomaly. We're not the norm of history.
Yeah.
And so as we think about, moving forward and having a legal psychedelics infrastructure, what are some of the concerns you have with for-profit companies getting involved, right? And as we look at, obviously, the pharmaceutical companies as the clear tangential sector, unfortunately, a lot of the way that they make profits is by ensuring that folks stay hooked on prescription substances, right? And they're more incentivized in a lot of ways to continue selling these medicines than for people to actually get healthy. And so I think that is understandably so, a lot of the main concerns for folks in the psychedelics industry. You've seen a lot of backlash against companies like Compass Pathways early on, where they're looking to patent specific substances that are grown naturally in nature. And so just would love to get your thoughts on how you view the outlook for these kind of competing factions, and what we can do to make sure that these substances remain widely available and affordable for the masses.
Yeah, that's absolutely a question that I think a lot of us that are kind of looking at this as it unfolds, kind of on the edge of our seats, and this kind of question of how is the piping, the capitalistic machine gonna potentially distort psychedelics, or on the opposite, how can it help kind of the spread in a safe way? And yeah, there's certainly a few, maybe this is another one I think we could probably talk about for hours. So maybe there's a few points that come to mind that we could talk about. I think one is as you kind of alluded to, this approach of trying to create a monopoly or something like a monopoly, either on a substance itself or on a protocol that allows one company or a small set of companies to kind of control these substances. Mm-hmm. And I mean, to geek out for one moment, because you asked kind of earlier about the differences between these molecules. A lot of the substances we're talking about are in the class of tryptamines. And so the DMT molecule is, you can look it up on Google, like the structure of the DMT molecule, and it's a little, circle with a little thing off it. And psilocybin is the exact same structure with like an extra chemical group added to it. I mean, LSD is actually also, as well as mescaline, the same thing. It's a DMT molecule with some kind of extra stuff around it. And so because of that, these are all kind of, we could say they're siblings. They're kind of siblings that could take you to a similar place in the internal realm, but slightly different flavors. And because of that, it's relatively trivial for a chemist or a pharmaceutical company to take it's not psilocybin anymore. It's psiloflybin. It's way more fly than psilocybin. We've added this extra chemical group to it. So that's one path that I'm sure that folks are going to try and take. And I have trouble seeing how that's going to. There may be a short term where someone's able to kind of get something through the FDA and have a short period of time, but because there are such a wide variety of these substances that have tremendous healing potential, I've trouble seeing like a long-term future where some company has a monopoly because they're the only chemical or only substance in town. But that's certainly something that folks are talking about. I do think it's quite interesting, if you look back, like as you're saying, even tobacco, right? Tobacco was used as a sacrament in native cultures here. And when that comes into the capitalistic machine, right? Well, how do we get people to smoke as much as possible? Let's make cigarettes really cool. Let's get people addicted to it. And it turns into something that actually is very harmful to society. And I can look at cannabis, and I used to live in Oakland until recently, and there's a period of time where you're driving down the highway, and I mean, at least 50% of the billboards are get cannabis delivery. Here's a different form factor of some drink or smokable, whatever. So it really is incentivized to kind of keep us high all the time, which is really I would say not the respectful way to work with this medicine. The interesting thing with psychedelics is that they are really not addictive, and part of the experience isn't always pleasant. Like when you're working with these plants and these substances, there are parts that are challenging, that feel like doing work. And because of that, you're usually not, okay, the next day, let's do it again. You kind of need some time to integrate the learnings. So I think they kind of have a built-in kind of resistance to that kind of dependency that the machine might try and force on us. I think you'll see a lot more push toward microdosing, because microdosing is, hey, there's a way to take something every day or every few days. So I think that's another way that we're going to see, a possible distortion. I think it's also worth mentioning just access, which is, who is going to be working with these incredible medicines. Because if they're, $800 a session and it's not covered by insurance, we're creating a type of medicine that is for rich people. And so this is actually something that I think our kind of capitalistic machine might be able to take a crack at and make some progress on. How do we come up with types of centers or facilities where we're able to get some sort of economies of scale and automation, and actually, can I have a robot therapist that's certified and drive down the price where we're still creating safe containers, because it's incredibly important to have an environment that's safe to work with these medicines, but that can bring the price down and make them more more sustainable and more affordable to folks who really need these medicines the most. So I'm very, very interested to see how that kind of evolves. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give you maybe one or two more and then I'll shut up. Because this is coming out, this is not like cannabis where there's going to be dispensaries and people are going to take psychedelics and go home. At least that seems to be maybe a decade away. We have this kind of situation where there's going to be a gatekeeper. There's going to be someone that you have to go and see and sit with to work with the medicine, whether this is in a kind of a ceremonial, church context or it's in a clinical context. So it'll be interesting to see, who's determining the gatekeepers. Who are the gatekeepers? Do they have to be licensed? What sort of protocols do they need to go through to get licensed? And there's certainly the potential for a sort of monopolistic kind of, okay, we're going to be the official gatekeeper and training program, and it's going to be very expensive to become a gatekeeper. And that's kind of another thing to kind of look at and make sure that this access is as broad as possible. Mm-hmm. And we can also talk, as investors, as a fellow investor, we look at who's participating in creating these companies. We've seen with cannabis, for example, that before legalization, that was largely an underground market that was disproportionately run by people of color, by people that are kind of left out of the normal system. And so we can ask, well, who's getting the funding to build these companies? Is it equal? Are we serving these kind of underserved populations, or are they getting kind of kicked out and replaced by these billion-dollar companies? So I think that's another thing to certainly be keeping an eye on as this expands. But despite all of these kind of potential worries, I would say I'm quite optimistic, because at the end of the day, I think the plants are smarter than we are. And I think it's as long as we're expanding access and providing reasonably safe containers, I think it's hard to screw up the amount of wisdom that's kind of contained in these plants as we interface with them. So I'll shut up there, but those are just some things that I think about.
Yeah, no, those are some super valuable insights. And one other question I had for you is, you talk about the need for access, which obviously will include getting licensed businesses and having the infrastructure up and running for substances like psilocybin. And I think everyone is eyes wide open at Oregon to see how that plays out. But then how do you think about the other end of the industry that's more focused, I'd say, on pharmaceutical development and kind of figuring out new substances and seeing what those new substances can do? Question being, where should we be focusing more today, right? On building the infrastructure for the psychedelics we already have, or creating new psychedelics to see what those potentials are, or both?
I think there's no stopping that there's going to be both. I mean, it's clear that there's just a whole zoo of substances that can be created. And there's a gentleman by the name of Alex Shulgin, who spent, it was actually one of the few folks that had basically approval from the DEA to be developing psychedelics over this kind of dark ages. Mm-hmm. And he published a couple of books that are just like compendiums of a ton of different of molecule substances that are kind of around the families that we're talking about. And, he experimented on them, with himself and his family, and kind of wrote about them. So there's no doubt that there's always going to be new substances, and there's going to be, particularly in this environment, there's going to be someone claiming this is the new miracle drug. The other ones are a sham, and by the way, we've patented it. And I think we do need to be dubious about kind of the claims there, because for me, I put my trust in these kind of substances that have, as we're talking about, these have thousands of years. The mescaline cactuses, for example, there's evidence of them 6,000 years ago being used in a ceremonial context, which is, really 6,000 years, really kind of mind blowing. So there's just a lot of history that, we can run clinical trials and kind of get some idea of results. But when something has been used safely in a culture for that amount of length, I kind of trust that type of clinical trial more than anything else. And so, I'm more interested in kind of the expansion of access and safe containers for the incredible medicines that we do have, while recognizing that, there's no stopping innovation. People are going to continue to come up with new things for years to come. And who knows, I'm sure there's some incredible things out there that, if we're talking in 10 years, can you believe we didn't have, 10 MEO DMT or whatever the next thing is.
Yeah, totally. It'll be, it's a really exciting time for the industry. I think, to your point, the plants are smarter than we are, and, we'll find a way to at least get to a better regime than we currently have today. I'm sure there's going to be hiccups along the way. There'll be things that could have been done better, but at the end of the day, as long as more people are getting access to better mental health options, then, I think we all win long term. Yeah,
I agree. I'm into that.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining this conversation. It was super fun. Would love to have you back on the podcast at some point as the industry continues to evolve and check back in.
Yeah, Jordan, I really appreciate you, taking the time and kind of playing with me on this topic. And if anyone is still listening, appreciate you for coming along for the ride. And, I think you mentioned Michael Pollan. If this is kind of a new topic to anyone listening, I think How to Change Your Mind is a fantastic book, and kind of providing a deeper dive into some of the history we've been talking about, and could be a good place to start. And I'm also happy. I'm on LinkedIn. My name is Benjamin Ross. I think on there, happy to chat with anyone about any of this stuff, or investing, or any of these games we play together. But really appreciate it, and excited to see where this all heads.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ben, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.